Welcome to Unit 3. In this unit, we're going to be getting started taking a more in-depth look at the law here and all of the legal components of special education and legal protections for individuals with disability. Click here on Unit 3 to get started. And before we walk through this module, I'm going to pull up the course schedule. Just make sure that we're reviewing that and that we're on track. You can see we've got discussion, expectations, just as usual, and then the activity due on the final evening of the unit by 11:59 p.m. We have our topics here, IDEA, Section 504, ADA, very important laws that we'll be reviewing throughout the course. Got your assigned reading. This is a unit with two different sections, and all that means is that there are two different categories or parts, different kinds of material. Not that something is due sooner or later, or that something belongs to another unit. They go alongside one another, and it's just a separation of information. So you'll see that we have a discussion board in this unit. And then, of course, to review all the content is always an expectation. But for submission, you'll have that discussion board and the IDEA regulation find and define assignment. And that's for activity credit. It's pretty straightforward. We'll take a look at it together. So we're here in Unit 3. I'm going to take a look at Part 1. You can see here the expectations again for submission. This is a little bit of an aside. Please let me know if you have any issues reviewing feedback in Canvas, because I do provide feedback for all written submissions. So if there are any concerns about that, please reach out, because I've got comments throughout the documents, and you should be able to access those in Canvas. A little note. I'll be taking a look at several different laws, but in particular IDEA versus 504 versus the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this is very important for us to be able to tell all of these apart. It's got a couple documents for comparison. Got the 504 law right here. It's a pretty lengthy document. You can pull that up in PDF format if you choose. You can see how far we can scroll down, but it's good to look into. Feel free to review that. You'll see that there are many different articles and resources provided throughout this unit. But I'm going to pull up this Prezi. I'm going to walk through part of it here together. And this Prezi was created by Dr. Todd Sunding. Just kind of taking a look at a few different concepts. While it's very important for us to understand all of these laws, in particular, we're taking a look at 504, Section 504, and IEP law, which is IDEA. Those are the two that will be most relevant generally for us in special education. So here we're talking about students with disabilities. We'll also address students with developmental delays. And here you see several examples. We might think of perhaps one eligibility category or two when we think about IEPs. But in reality, there are many different conditions and factors that can qualify a child for either an IEP or a 504 plan, or perhaps one of the plans that falls into the early intervention, which we'll take a look at here momentarily. So see, we've got several different laws. We're really going to focus on IDEA and 504 and the ADA here. So for IDEA, this really is our major special education law. I'm going to pull up a little list here, disability categories. You may hear some different terminology used in different states or districts, but main ideas are here. We've got autism, students who are both deaf and visually impaired, students who are deaf and hard of hearing, students who have developmental delays, and these are covered under a different part of IDEA called Part C. And then later on, as children get older, they're covered under Part B. Serious emotional disability, SED, is a qualifier, and oftentimes terminology that you might hear is EBD, emotional or behavioral disorders, some people might use, or another term that's been coming around more frequently is affective needs programming. And this is for students with significant impact of challenges with emotional regulation or social emotional functioning that causes them major impact in their ability to access the general education curriculum and causes them to need an IEP in order to have that access. So we've got students who are deaf and hard of hearing, intellectual disability. This would have to do with both cognitive scores that are taken into consideration as well as adaptive scores and just overall evaluation of functioning for an intellectual disability. Multiple disabilities. A person may have several different impacts. Got a variety of others here. The ones that you'll most frequently see are other health impairments, OHI. There are many, as you can see, many different factors and things that can cause a student to be eligible for OHI, but the one that we see perhaps most frequently, I say that not out of any actual data, but just in my own experience, most frequently I've seen OHI related to attention. So frequently with an ADHD diagnosis, you'll see an OHI eligibility. For other health impairment, ADHD is not its own category for eligibility, but it does fall under OHI. And specific learning disability. This could be in mathematics, reading, rating, or two of the three, or all three. That would be that significant academic delay that is not a result of poor instruction or lack of access or English as a second language. Got speech or language impairment. And that would be a student who's impacted primarily by SLI, or they could have a secondary eligibility. And then obviously there's the visual impairment, so that's an important one to take a look at. Just keep all of these categories in mind. This is provided to you. We want to look as well at this comparison between IEPs and 504s. Keep in mind as we go back to the Prezi that IEP is under the IDEA. It's a lot of acronyms, but that is the relationship there, whereas the 504 plan is covered under Section 504, and there are differences. So you'll see here for IDEA, back to the Prezi. Part C, as we mentioned, would be for that early intervention. Part B begins right as a student exits Part C and can last all the way up to age of 21. That's related to special education. So there are many different agencies, particularly for early intervention. You may see community center boards. You may be able to think of one in your area. These are generally the ones who would organize the evaluation and in-home services or whatever might be relevant for the child for those Part C services, and then Part B would be managed by the school districts. And in order to be eligible for special education services and eligible under Part B or Part C, it is necessary to go through a comprehensive evaluation by a multidisciplinary team of professionals who specialize in their content areas. And if a student is found to be eligible, a plan is made. So the IFSP, taking a look, we do have a couple of resources here. That would be a plan that a child would receive and the family would receive for early intervention if there is a concern. And then under Part B, that's the IEP, so the Individualized Education Program. This is the document that structures special education services. And transition also is very important, especially as students come up to the age of 14, it's very important to be planning with transition goals in mind for post-secondary functioning and success and access to the community or to employment in whatever way might be relevant, to education or training in whatever way might be relevant for that person. So obviously informing families, connecting them with resources, being available to answer questions. And this Prezi does offer many different resources. The Prezi is located right here in the Canvas shell if you need it. We're going to take a brief look at this website to compare IEP and 504. So the 504 plan, really the difference, although there are many, which you can see on this web page, which will also be in Canvas, the difference is that the IEP is much more in-depth document than the 504, and that the IEP creates an individualized special education experience. It may include related services, and it falls under the guidelines and eligibility categories under IDEA. The 504 plan is more about the idea of removing barriers so that the student can adequately access general education curriculum. It's much lighter of a plan in comparison when you're looking at depth and intensity of intervention, service provision, accommodation, perhaps modification, etc. There are many, many different ideas here that help us to tell the difference. For instance, for those who create the IEP, there's a very particular list of who needs to be present, and a 504 is much less intense. So parent, guardian, caregiver, teachers, administrator. You can see that the 504 plan may have some accommodations, naming who will provide the services, but the IEP is much larger and lengthier of a document. Present levels of performance, annual goals, frequent progress monitoring, which typically would be entered into a system for the IEP, services, and that's where that specialized instruction and related services would come in. That is not a part of Section 504. You'll see assessment, inclusion, placement, least restrictive environment. Lots of differences here. So feel free to take a look at that. And you'll see more resources here for the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA is also quite relevant, but it will be more related to things you might see in the community or in the workplace, more about accessibility. Feel free to check out a couple different websites. This is called Ask Jan, and it does provide accommodation ideas for people in the workplace, for individuals with a variety of disabilities, ideas for accommodation to help them to perform the tasks of their jobs. Here we are in part 2. So you can see there's a paper here for you to review. Lots of different reading resources here. More information on the history of IDEA. There are a lot of acts and a lot of laws, so take your time. Just make sure that you get the chance to access these resources. They will be helpful. More information on the very beginning until the very end. By the end, I mean the most recent reauthorization. Information on regulations and case law. These are the submissions for our unit. So first you'll see the discussion, and this is the idea of analysis of the changes that you've seen starting at the beginning of these laws and then up until the most recent reauthorization. What trends do you see? I'm going to address ESSA, which you also can read and research. And then finally for our activity, you're going to be finding and defining each of these things. You'll define them in your own words and then cite the regulation number. We've got a list of 10. There's an example here. And there is a template, so do use this. And if you need a full PDF of IDEA, there is one linked for you on this page. All right, that's it for Unit 3.